I'm here with Richard Wakeford, who was the head of the Scottish Government Environment Department. Hello, Richard. What is your specific policy task and your role?
Well, the policy task which was most interesting was when the Scottish National Party won the first of their elections. They charged us with creating a greener strategic approach across all of government policies in Scotland. And as head of the Environment Department, my job was to make that happen. There were all sorts of issues about what greener meant, and frankly, if we had ecosystem services analysis available at the time, I think probably I'd have made a better job of explaining what it was all about.
Can you briefly highlight your journey and sort of focusing on the various tools that you drew on?
Well, basically, what I tried to do was to focus the thinking of my team and ministers and the wider public on outcomes as distinct from processes, because the outcomes were the ones which we were really trying to gain, and yet people often get tied up in processes and forget what it is those processes are designing to achieve. The second thing that we did was look to join up approaches. So instead of having a kind of a transport policy and an environment policy, we looked to see what a joined up transport and environment policy meant, and actually how that tied up with other policies. So we needed a joined up approach across what used to be separate government departments. And in fact, we scrapped government departments altogether while I was there to just create one body to emphasise the need for the strategic policies to run right the way across government. The third thing that I'm quite proud of is the way in which we started to change the grant schemes, the financial payments that we were making to encourage people to behave in particular ways, so that they reflected the value to society of what they would do to meet the grant conditions, as distinct from just refunding their costs, because quite often that makes the budget run better if you've actually delivered more societal benefits for your same pound.
So how would you say that this approach and the tools that you used have added value to the policy process?
Well, it's a couple of years since I was involved in that, but when I was recently in Scotland, people are still proud of the process that is in place in which Scottish Government priorities are established around 5 strategic policies, and green is actually wedded right the way across that. So the work that we did has clearly stuck.
How would you describe the key hurdles that you faced, and how did you deal with them?
I think there was an issue about, I would say that there was an issue around people focusing on processes as distinct from focusing on outcomes. So one of the big challenges was to get people to think about where we wanted to be, and then what tools you needed to put in place to get us to that point, rather than thinking about going into the office and processing things without thinking about what they contributed to the whole. And that enabled us to reprioritise the resources a bit, so that we actually put more efforts into the things that were really needed. The second thing that was really important to us was to work with the whole organisation. And if there are things which could have been better, perhaps I should have spent even more time with people throughout the organisation and with stakeholders, trying to communicate the overall approach. Because the point is that it's not the regulations and the procedures and so on that actually ultimately determine what happens in society. It's the mindsets of the people who are operating those things.
That's a very interesting sort of lesson and insight that you gained. Were there other lessons that you've learned from this process?
Well, we did a lot of research, and I actually brought a chief scientific advisor into my part of the Scottish Government in order to strengthen the scientific backing, so that ministers actually had science, more access to science, to underpin what it was that we were advising them that they should be doing. But we had very little evaluation. So in a sense, the balance between research and evaluation was wrong. We weren't learning enough lessons from the things that we were doing to see whether they were delivering, how much they were contributing. But I think this is a point across the whole of government generally. Sometimes we tell stories by the time an evaluation of a policy comes through, the ministers responsible for that policy have long gone in a reshuffle. So therefore, evaluations don't have the same political currency and therefore don't seem to be so important as dealing with the next agenda of the minister that's in place at the moment. So I think we could have done that. But generally, one of the things I struggled with was that the environmental bodies and the industry bodies and others who were coming to help us shape the policies and the instruments looked too much at the details of how they wanted the law changed, the processes changed, and didn't do enough to focus on the overall outcome and how, in a sense, an alignment of society as a whole would start to make that outcome easier to deliver. Because governments can't regulate for everything. In the end, it's the way in which people behave within the framework of laws and policies that governments set out.
Yeah, just finally, I'd be interested to hear sort of in your current work, how does the ecosystem approach to ecosystem services framework feature? Because you said if you had known about it earlier, it would have made a difference.
Well, what I'm doing now is working with a number of different institutions and universities on research projects. I'm also a board member of an Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty board, and I'm a town councillor. And the ecosystem services thinking is something you can have a really good and lively conversation in academic circles about. If I go to my town council, if I go to the board of my Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, there isn't the knowledge there, there isn't the awareness. You can get there, you can start to tell the story, but there's a long way to go before the instruments that they have been fine-tuned to reflect better the academic and research thinking that there is about ecosystem services today.
Thank you very much, Richard.